The grease under Staff Sergeant Alexis Montgomery's fingernails had been there so long, it felt permanent. At 29, she moved through Thunderbird Air Base's maintenance hangar like a ghost in steel-toed. Boots' black hair pulled back in a regulation. Bun, safety glasses perpetually smudged, her faded green coveralls telling the story everyone thought they knew. Just another mechanic. Just another pair of hands keeping helicopters airborne. But when 15 oil rig workers found themselves trapped in a Wyoming blizzard with no way out, this just a mechanic would do something that would rewrite everything. Anyone thought they knew about limits, courage, and what one person could accomplish when lives hung in the balance. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Jordan Price had been asking questions for 3 weeks now. Fresh out of tech school, 22 years old, and eager to prove himself, he watched Alexis work with the kind of intensity that made the veteran mechanics uncomfortable. There was something about the way she moved around the aircraft that didn't match her supposed experience level. "Hey Lex," Jordan called out on a Tuesday morning, watching her inspect the rotor assembly of Viper 14 with surgical precision. "Why do all the pilots specifically request you for their pre-flight checks? I mean, no offense, but Technical Sergeant Bell has been here way longer." The hangar went quiet. Even the constant hum of compressors seemed to pause. Morgan Bell, who'd been torquing bolts on a nearby UH-60, looked up with the expression of someone watching a rookie step on a landmine. Cassandra Liu stopped her welding work entirely, pulling up her mask to see how this would play out. Alexis didn't look up from her inspection checklist. "Experience," she said simply, running her hands along the helicopter's control linkages with movements that seemed almost intimate in their familiarity. "But you've only been in maintenance for 4 years, right?" Jordan pressed, genuinely confused. "I looked at your service record. Before that, it just says flight operations. What did you do there, crew chief?" The silence stretched like a taut wire. Morgan Bell cleared her throat carefully. "Montgomery knows helicopters," she said, her voice carrying a warning. "Leave it at that, kid." But Jordan was young and curious, and he'd noticed things that didn't add up. The way pilots deferred to Alexis during briefings, even though she wore sergeant stripes instead of officer bars. How she could diagnose engine problems by sound alone, from 50 yards away. The modifications she'd made to various aircraft that somehow improved performance beyond factory specifications. And there was something else, the way she moved around the machines like she belonged in them, not under them. What Jordan didn't know, what most people on base had forgotten or never learned, was that Staff Sergeant Alexis Montgomery had once been something extraordinary. 4 years ago, she'd been Thunderbird's most elite search and rescue pilot, Captain Montgomery, they'd called her then. Over 200 emergency missions across some of the most unforgiving terrain in the American West. She could fly through mountain passes that other pilots wouldn't attempt in perfect weather, navigate by terrain features alone when GPS failed, land on oil platforms in crosswinds that exceeded safety margins. Other pilots had called her the Phantom because she appeared out of nowhere when people needed saving most. She had an intuitive understanding of aircraft that bordered on supernatural. She could feel mechanical problems before instruments detected them, predict weather patterns by the way wind moved through her rotors, land in spaces that shouldn't have been possible. Her service record told a story of consistent excellence, successful extractions from offshore, oil rigs during storms, mountain rescues above the tree line in zero visibility, emergency evacuations from wildfire zones where other aircraft couldn't penetrate the smoke. She'd never lost a person she was sent to save. Not once. Then came the mission that changed everything. It was supposed to be routine medical evacuation from a forward operating base in Somalia. Injured contractor, stable condition, standard transport back to the main hospital. But as Alexis was preparing for takeoff, word came through that another helicopter had gone down 40 miles northeast. 2 crew members, including her fiancé, Lieutenant David Chun, were trapped in hostile territory with enemy forces closing in. The choice was brutal in its simplicity: follow her orders and complete the medical evacuation, or abandon her mission to attempt a rescue that had already been deemed too dangerous by command. Protocol was clear. Chain of command was absolute. The injured contractor needed immediate medical attention, but David was out there. David, who'd taught her advanced flying techniques during their off-duty hours. David, who'd proposed to her 3 months earlier with a ring hidden in her flight helmet. David, who was probably bleeding out in wreckage while she sat on a tarmac following orders. She followed orders, completed the medical evacuation, saved the contractor's life, and listened to the radio chatter 45 minutes later as David and his co-pilot were confirmed KIA killed in action. When their position was overrun before backup could arrive, the guilt consumed her like acid. She'd had the skills, the aircraft, the opportunity to save the person she loved most, and she'd chosen duty over heart. For 6 months afterward, she flew missions mechanically, perfectly, but without the intuitive brilliance that had made her legendary. The joy was gone. The connection between pilot and machine felt severed. Finally, she'd requested a transfer. From captain to staff sergeant. From flight operations to ground maintenance. Everyone assumed she'd lost her nerve, that the pressure had finally broken her. The whispers followed her everywhere. Shame about Montgomery. Such a waste of talent. At least she's good with tools. But here's what nobody understood. Alexis hadn't stopped being a pilot. She'd become something more dangerous, a pilot who knew every aircraft on base better than their manufacturers did. For 4 years, she'd been rebuilding, modifying, perfecting every helicopter that came through her hangar. She'd installed upgraded navigation systems, enhanced communication equipment, modified engine parameters for better high-altitude performance. She'd memorized every sound, every vibration, every subtle indication that could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophe. She was still watching, still listening, still preparing, waiting for the moment when her skills would matter again, when the choice between following orders and saving lives would present itself one more time. That moment was coming sooner than anyone expected. The Wyoming. Winter was brutal that year, but Tuesday morning seemed manageable. Light snow, moderate winds, standard conditions for the oil fields that dotted the landscape around Thunderbird Air Base. Alexis arrived at 0530, coffee in a dented thermos, tool belt hanging from her hips like a gunslinger's rig. The day's schedule showed routine maintenance, nothing that should have required her particular expertise. At 0800, the emergency call came in. The call crackled through the base communication system with the kind of urgency that made everyone stop what they were doing. Alexis was calibrating pressure gauges on Viper 14 when Colonel Nathan Reed's voice echoed through the hangar speakers. All personnel, priority emergency briefing in Conference Room Alpha. Immediate response required. Jordan Price looked up from the hydraulic system he'd been bleeding, confusion written across his young face. Emergency briefings weren't common at Thunderbird, and when they happened, maintenance personnel weren't usually included. But something about the colonel's tone suggested this wasn't routine. Alexis set down her tools deliberately, her movements betraying none of the tension that had suddenly gripped her chest. She'd heard that tone before, in Somalia, in Afghanistan, in a dozen other places where people's lives hung in the balance. Her hands, steady as always, betrayed nothing of the adrenaline beginning to course through her system. The conference room was packed when they arrived. Pilots, crew chiefs, medical personnel, even administrative staff, everyone who might be needed for a major operation. Colonel Reed stood at the front, his weathered face grim under the fluorescent lights. studying a tablet displaying weather data that looked increasingly ominous. 47 minutes ago, he began without preamble. We lost contact with Platform 7, an offshore oil drilling operation approximately 120 miles northwest of our position. Last communication indicated they were experiencing severe mechanical failures and requesting immediate evacuation due to an incoming storm system. Alexis felt her pulse quicken. Offshore platforms were notoriously difficult rescue scenarios, limited landing space, unpredictable weather, and if something went wrong, there was nowhere to set down except the churning ocean. "How many personnel?" asked Captain Dakota Wells, Thunderbird's senior search and rescue pilot. 15, Reed replied. 12 crew members and 3 engineers who were conducting emergency repairs. The platform's primary helicopter is down for maintenance, and their backup evacuation boat was damaged in yesterday's storm. Lieutenant Casey Owen raised her hand. "Sir, what's our window? Weather's been deteriorating all morning." Reed gestured to the meteorological display behind him. "That's the problem. We're looking at a Category 4 winter storm system moving in faster than predicted. Current conditions are marginal for flight operations. In 6 hours, they'll be completely unsurvivable." The room erupted in quiet discussion as pilots began calculating distances, fuel requirements, and payload capacities. Alexis remained silent, but her mind was already working through the logistics. Platform 7, she knew it well. She'd flown there twice during her active duty years, both times in challenging conditions. The platform had a helipad that was adequate in good weather, but became a postage stamp in high winds. The approach required threading between 2 massive drilling towers, with crosswinds that could flip an aircraft if the pilot wasn't careful. "Sir," Captain Wells said, standing up, "I'll take the primary rescue. Give me Viper 11 with full crew and medical equipment." "Negative," Reed replied immediately. "Current weather reports show winds gusting to 55 mph with visibility dropping below minimums. I'm grounding all flight operations until conditions improve." "But sir," Owen protested, "if we wait for the storm to pass, those 15 people will be dead," Reed finished grimly. "I know, but I won't authorize suicide missions. We wait for the weather to clear and hope there are survivors to rescue." The room fell silent. Everyone understood the math. 15 people trapped on a platform with no escape route, facing a storm that would likely tear the structure apart or freeze anyone left exposed. It was a death sentence disguised as prudent command. Alexis stood up slowly, her movement drawing surprised looks from around the room. She rarely spoke during briefings and never challenged command decisions. "Sir, what about modified rescue protocols?" Reed looked at her with surprise. "Sergeant Montgomery, this is a pilot briefing. I appreciate your technical expertise, but Platform 7's helipad specifications allow for emergency landings in crosswinds up to 65 mph. If the pilot uses non-standard approach vectors," Alexis interrupted, something she'd never done in 4 years of ground duty. "The platform's structural engineering can handle helicopter operations in conditions that would normally ground aircraft, provided the landing is executed using offshore platform protocols." The room turned to stare at her. Jordan Price's mouth actually fell open. How did a maintenance sergeant know offshore platform landing specifications? Captain Wells frowned. "Montgomery, where did you get that information?" "Platform 7's technical specs aren't included in standard maintenance manuals." Alexis hesitated for a moment, feeling the weight of every eye in the room. "I studied them during my previous assignment. Emergency preparedness protocols." "Your previous assignment was flight operations," Lieutenant Owen said slowly, realization dawning. "What did you do in flight operations, Sergeant?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Reed looked at Alexis with new interest, his eyes narrowing as he studied her face. Montgomery, your service record shows flight operations experience, but it's classified above my clearance level. What exactly did you do before maintenance? For 4 years, Alexis had deflected questions, changed subjects, maintained the fiction that she was just another technician who happened to know more than most about aircraft systems. But 15 people were about to die, and she was possibly the only person in the room who could save them. I was a search and rescue pilot, sir, she said quietly. 7 years active duty, Captain Montgomery, before my transfer. The silence was deafening. Captain Wells stared at her like she'd just announced she was from Mars. Owen's face showed a mixture of confusion and dawning respect. Jordan Price looked like someone had just revealed that the janitor was actually a brain surgeon. Reed set down his tablet and studied her carefully. Captain Montgomery. I remember that name from the commendation reports. Somalia, Afghanistan, domestic operations. You're the pilot they called the Phantom. Yes, sir. The pilot who never lost a rescue. The one who pulled off those impossible extractions that made the textbooks. Yes, sir. Reed was quiet for a long moment, processing this revelation. And you've been working maintenance for 4 years because... Personal reasons, sir. Alexis's voice remained steady, but those who knew her could see the pain that flickered across her face. Personal reasons, Reed repeated. He looked around. The room at his pilots, good pilots all of them, but none with experience in the kind of extreme conditions that Platform 7 would require. Then he looked back at Alexis, seeing her for the first time not as the quiet sergeant from the motor pool, but as the legendary pilot whose reputation had preceded her to Thunderbird. Captain Montgomery, he said, unconsciously using her former rank, what would you need to execute a rescue mission to Platform 7? The question electrified the room. Alexis felt her heart rate spike, the familiar pre-mission adrenaline that she hadn't experienced in 4 years. Sir, I'd need Viper 14. I've been maintaining that aircraft personally, and I've made modifications that would give us the performance margins necessary for platform operations in marginal weather. What kind of modifications? Enhanced navigation systems for low visibility operations. Upgraded communication equipment for coordinating with platform personnel. Modified engine parameters for better performance in high wind conditions. Reinforced landing gear for hard platform landings. Wells looked stunned. You've been modifying our aircraft without authorization? I've been improving them, Alexis corrected. Every modification is within acceptable engineering parameters and actually exceeds safety specifications. I documented everything, but since I was maintenance personnel, the reports went to Technical Sergeant Bell, not Flight Operations. Morgan. Bell, who had been silent throughout the briefing, finally spoke up. Sir, Montgomery's modifications are works of art. She's turned our standard helicopters into specialized rescue machines. I've been meaning to recommend her for commendation. But ... quote, she trailed off, realizing the implications of what she was saying. Reed looked at the weather display again. The storm was intensifying, and time was running out. Montgomery, when was the last time you flew? 4 years, 3 months, and 16 days ago, sir. The precision of her answer told everyone in the room exactly how much that last flight had meant to her, and how much she'd been counting the days since. And you think you can still do it? Fly a rescue mission in conditions that I won't authorize my current pilots to attempt. Alexis looked him straight in the eye. Sir, I think I'm the only one who can. Colonel Reed studied Alexis for what felt like an eternity, his command experience warring with the desperate mathematics of the situation. 15 lives against military protocol, regulations against results. The safe choice against the only choice that might work. Montgomery, he said finally, step outside with me. The corridor outside Conference Room Alpha was empty, fluorescent lights humming overhead like mechanical insects. Reed closed the door behind them and turned to face the woman he was seeing clearly for the first time in 4 years. Tell me why. He said simply, Sir, tell me why a decorated captain with one of the most distinguished service records I've ever seen requested a transfer to maintenance duty. Tell me why the Phantom disappeared and Sergeant Montgomery took her place. Alexis was quiet for a long moment, her hands clasped behind her back in perfect military posture. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. Somalia, sir. Operation Restore Hope, February 15th, 4 years ago. I was executing a routine medical evacuation injured contractor, stable condition, standard transport. While I was preparing for takeoff, another bird went down 40 miles northeast. 2 crew members trapped in hostile territory. Reed waited, understanding that some stories couldn't be rushed. One of them was Lieutenant David Chun, my fiancée. Her voice remained steady, but her knuckles whitened. Command declared the area too hot for immediate rescue. Protocol was clear: complete my mission, return to base, wait for clearance. The contractor needed immediate medical attention. Standard chain of command. But you wanted to go after Chun. I could have saved him, sir. I had the aircraft, the skills, the opportunity. But I followed orders, completed the evacuation. Saved the contractor's life. She paused, her jaw tightening. David and his co-pilot were overrun 23 minutes. Before backup arrived, Kia. Reed understood now. The guilt that had driven one of the Air Force's most gifted pilots into self-imposed exile. The weight of a choice between duty and love that no one should have to make. You blame yourself for following orders. I blame myself for not trusting. My judgment over protocol. For choosing the safe, correct decision over the right one. She met his eyes directly. I swore that if I ever faced that choice again, I'd choose differently. Even if it meant court-martial? Even if it meant the end of your career? Sir, my career ended the day I let the person I loved most die because I was too afraid to break the rules. Reed was quiet, processing the implications. He'd commanded enough soldiers to recognize the look in her eyes, the expression of someone who had already lost everything that mattered and therefore had nothing left to fear. Montgomery, if I authorize this mission and something goes wrong, it's my responsibility. If you don't make it back, I'm the one who signed your death warrant. And if you don't authorize it, sir, you're signing 15 death warrants instead of 1. The mathematics were brutal in their simplicity. Reed looked through the conference room window at his assembled pilots, good people, skilled aviators, but none with the combination of experience and modified equipment that might make the impossible possible. The storm conditions are within my operational parameters, sir. I've flown rescue missions in worse weather. Platform 7 specifications allow for emergency operations that exceed standard safety margins. And Viper 14's modifications give us capabilities that standard aircraft don't have. You've been planning for this. It wasn't a question. Reed could see it in her eyes, the same focused intensity he'd recognized in special operations personnel, who had spent years preparing for scenarios that might never come. Sir, every modification I've made, every system I've upgraded, every hour I've spent studying platform specifications and extreme weather protocols, it's all been preparation. For a moment like this, when following the safe choice means people die. Reed understood. For 4 years, while everyone thought she'd lost her nerve, Montgomery had been turning herself into something unprecedented, a pilot with intimate knowledge of every aircraft system, equipped with capabilities beyond standard specifications, ready for missions that no one else could attempt. If I authorize this, and you succeed, it sets a precedent. Other personnel might think they can ignore orders whenever they disagree with command decisions. If you don't authorize this, and 15 people die when they could have been saved, it sets a different precedent, sir. That we value procedure over people. The colonel was silent for nearly a minute, weighing options that all seemed impossible. Finally, he spoke. Montgomery, I cannot and will not authorize an unsanctioned rescue mission into weather conditions that exceed safety parameters. Is that understood? Alexis felt her heart sink. Yes, sir. However, Reed continued, I can authorize a test flight of Viper 14's modifications to evaluate their performance in marginal weather conditions. Such a test might reasonably include a flight path that passes near Platform 7, purely for navigational reference purposes. Their eyes met, and understanding passed between them like an electric current. Sir, such a test flight would require careful documentation of the aircraft's performance parameters. Naturally. And if during such a test flight, the pilot happened to encounter personnel in distress, military protocol would require rendering assistance. Of course, sir. Good Samaritan protocols override standard mission parameters. Reed nodded slowly. The test flight is authorized, Captain Montgomery. Viper 14, full fuel, emergency medical equipment for documentation purposes. You'll file a post-mission report detailing all systems performance. For the first time in 4 years, Alexis Montgomery smiled. Thank you, sir. Don't thank me yet. Thank me when you bring everyone home. They returned to the conference room where the assembled personnel looked up expectantly. Reed addressed the room with the same calm authority he'd used to command. Units in 3 different combat zones. We're going to conduct a test flight of Sergeant Montgomery's aircraft modifications. Captain Wells, you'll coordinate ground support. Lieutenant Owen, prepare emergency medical protocols. Montgomery, you have 1 hour to prep Viper 14. Sir, Captain Wells said slowly. We're testing equipment, Captain. Nothing more, nothing less. As the briefing dispersed, Jordan Price approached Alexis with an expression of mixed awe and confusion. Sergeant, Captain, I don't understand. All this time you were. I was exactly who I needed to be, Alexis replied, heading toward the hangar. And now I need to be something else. She had 58 minutes to prepare for a mission that would either vindicate 4 years of preparation or confirm everyone's worst fears about the price of second chances. The clock was ticking, and 15 lives hung in the balance. Alexis moved through the hangar with purpose she hadn't felt in 4 years, every step deliberate as she approached Viper 14. The aircraft sat like a sleeping predator, its matte black paint absorbing the fluorescent lights overhead. To anyone else, it looked like a standard UH-60 Black Hawk, but Alexis knew better. She'd spent 4 years turning this machine into something extraordinary. Jordan Price jogged to catch up with her, his tool belt jangling. Captain, sorry. I don't know what to call you anymore. Alexis is fine, she replied, running her hands along the aircraft's fuselage with the familiarity of a pianist checking their instrument. And I need you to help me with the pre-flight. This isn't going to be a standard inspection. What do you need me to do? Everything has to be perfect, Jordan. 15 people are counting on systems that have never been tested under these conditions. She pulled open an access panel, revealing wiring that was far more complex than standard military specifications. Check the enhanced navigation array. Red and blue lights should be solid green. Any flickering means we abort. As Jordan began his inspection, Technical Sergeant Bell approached with a tablet and a concerned expression. Montgomery, I've been reviewing your modification logs. Some of this work is ... double quotes. She paused, searching for the right words. It's beyond anything I've seen in 20 years of maintenance. Is it safe? Safe? It's genius. You've essentially created a custom search and rescue platform. Enhanced power distribution, modified rotor dynamics for high wind stability, upgraded avionics that integrate civilian and military navigation systems. Bell shook her head in amazement. Where did you learn to do this kind of work? Alexis continued her inspection, checking hydraulic pressure readings that she'd memorized down to the decimal point. I had a lot of time to study, Sergeant. 4 years of time. But this level of integration, The engine modifications alone would require advanced aerospace engineering knowledge. My father was a helicopter mechanic before he became a pilot, Alexis said, not looking up from her checklist. He taught me that understanding the machine was just as important as knowing how to fly it. After David died, I had plenty of motivation to become the best damn maintenance tech in the Air Force. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. 20 minutes into the pre-flight, Captain Wells approached with a weather update that made everyone's blood run cold. Montgomery, conditions are deteriorating faster than predicted. We're looking at 60-mile-per-hour sustained winds with gusts to 80. Visibility is dropping below a quarter mile. Alexis studied the meteorological data on Wells' tablet, her expression unreadable. Platform 7's last communication? 18 minutes ago. Emergency power only, structural damage to the main support columns, and they're reporting personnel injuries. They've got maybe 2 hours before the platform either loses structural integrity or the storm kills anyone left exposed. 2 hours. Alexis repeated, calculating distances and fuel consumption in her head. That's workable? Workable? Lieutenant Owen had joined the group, her face showing the strain of coordinating emergency protocols. Montgomery, these wind speeds would. Ground commercial aviation. Even military operations have limits. Commercial aviation doesn't have my modifications, Alexis replied calmly, checking the fuel quantity for the 3rd time. And military operations don't usually have pilots who've spent 4 years preparing for exactly this scenario. She walked around to the helicopter's communication array, where additional equipment had been mounted with military precision. Enhanced weather radar with real-time storm tracking. Direct satellite communication that works even when ground-based. Systems fail. Navigation systems that integrate GPS, terrain mapping, and platform-specific approach data. Owen stared at the additional equipment. You installed all of this yourself? Every wire, every circuit, every calibration. Alexis opened another access panel, revealing backup systems that shouldn't have existed on a standard aircraft. Redundant power distribution, backup hydraulics, emergency navigation that works when everything else fails. This aircraft can operate in conditions that would kill a standard helicopter. Jordan emerged from beneath the aircraft, his uniform stained with hydraulic fluid, but his expression showing satisfaction. All systems check out perfect, Alexis. Whatever you did to this bird, it's running better than factory specs. It should be. I rebuilt half the systems from scratch. She pulled on her flight helmet, the familiar weight settling like coming home. Morgan, I need you to coordinate with platform personnel. Direct communication on emergency frequency 243.0. Already. Set up, Bell replied. What's your extraction plan? Alexis studied the platform schematics on her tablet, the same diagram she'd memorized 4 years ago and reviewed countless times since. Platform 7's helipad is 35 feet square, elevated 60 feet above sea level. Standard approach is from the southwest, but in these wind conditions, I'll need to come in from the northeast to use the drilling towers as wind breaks. That approach vector puts you between 2 massive steel structures in near-zero visibility, Wells pointed out. If you misjudge the distance by even a few feet, I don't misjudge distances, Alexis interrupted, her voice carrying the quiet confidence of someone who had made hundreds of similar calculations under pressure. And I've made this approach before, in worse conditions. When? 6 years ago. Night mission, equipment failure on Platform 7, storm conditions similar to today, extracted 12 personnel with 0 incidents. She pulled on her flight gloves, fingers automatically, checking the controls one final time. The difference is, this time I know the aircraft better than I know myself. Colonel Reed's voice crackled over the hangar's communication system. "Montgomery, you're cleared for test flight. Weather window is closing fast. You've got maybe 90 minutes before conditions become unsurvivable, even for you." Alexis climbed into the pilot's seat, her hands finding the controls with muscle memory that 4 years hadn't diminished. The cockpit felt like coming home, every switch and gauge exactly where it should be. She'd spent countless hours sitting in this seat during maintenance, but always as a mechanic checking systems. This was different. This was returning to who she really was. "Viper 14 to Thunderbird Control," she spoke into her headset, her voice carrying the calm authority that had once made her legendary. "Pre-flight complete. All systems nominal. Ready for test flight departure." "Roger, Viper 14. Weather conditions are marginal and deteriorating. Use extreme caution." As the rotors began to spin up, their familiar wop-wop building to operational speed, Alexis felt something she hadn't experienced in 4 years. Absolute certainty. This was what she was meant to do. This was who she was meant to be. Jordan stood clear of the aircraft, giving her a thumbs up through the side window. Morgan Bell was coordinating with platform personnel over the radio. Captain Wells and Lieutenant Owen watched from the hangar entrance, their expressions mixing admiration with concern. But all of that faded as Alexis lifted Viper 14 into the Wyoming sky, heading northwest toward a platform where 15 people were counting on a miracle they didn't even know was coming. The storm was waiting for her, and she was ready for the storm. The first 20 miles of flight were deceptively calm. Alexis guided Viper 14 northwest through scattered snow flurries and moderate turbulence, the kind of conditions that would have grounded less experienced pilots, but felt routine to someone with her background. The enhanced navigation systems she'd installed were performing flawlessly, painting a detailed picture of terrain and weather patterns that standard aircraft couldn't access. "Viper 14 to Thunderbird Control," she reported over the radio, her voice steady as she monitored the approaching storm system. 20 miles out, all systems nominal. Weather conditions manageable but deteriorating ahead. "Copy, Viper 14. Platform 7 reports they can see your approach lights. Winds at platform are gusting to 70 mph. Recommend abort and return to base." Alexis checked her instrument panel, where wind speed indicators showed exactly what control had reported. 70-mile-per-hour gusts were beyond the operational limits of standard helicopters. But Viper 14 wasn't standard, and neither was she. "Negative control. Continuing approach for equipment evaluation." The storm hit her like a physical blow 30 miles from the platform. One moment she was flying through moderate turbulence. The next she was fighting for control as winds tried to flip the aircraft upside down. Snow struck the windscreen with the force of rifle bullets, and visibility dropped to 0 in seconds. This was where 4 years of preparation met 4 years of anticipation. Alexis switched to instrument flight immediately, her hands moving across controls with practiced precision. The enhanced navigation array painted a 3-dimensional picture of her surroundings, even when her eyes couldn't penetrate the swirling white chaos outside. "Jesus," she breathed, fighting a crosswind. That would have torn a standard helicopter apart. But Viper 14's modified rotor dynamics held steady, the aircraft responding to her inputs with the precision of a surgical instrument. The radio crackled with static as Platform 7 tried to establish contact. "Incoming aircraft, this is Platform 7 Control. We have 0 visibility and winds exceeding safe landing parameters. Recommend you abort approach immediately." "Platform 7, this is Captain Montgomery, United States Air Force. I'm inbound for emergency extraction. What's your personnel status?" "Captain, we have 15 souls on board, 3 with serious injuries from structural collapse. But landing conditions are impossible. Our helipad is taking direct hits from debris, and we can't even see our own landing lights." Alexis checked her position using the modified GPS array that integrated civilian, military, and maritime navigation systems. She was 12 miles out, flying through conditions that meteorologists would later describe as unsurvivable. Ice was forming on her rotors faster than the heating elements could melt it. The aircraft bucked and rolled like an angry horse butt. She read the storm's personality through subtle vibrations in the control stick. Platform 7, I need you to activate emergency strobes and clear all personnel from the helipad area. I'm coming in from the northeast approach vector. Northeast? Captain, that approach puts you between Tower Alpha and Tower Beta in 0. Visibility, that's suicide. It's the only approach that uses the drilling towers as windbreaks, Alexis replied, adjusting her heading to compensate for drift that would have confused less experienced pilots. Trust me, I've done this before. She had indeed done this before, but not in conditions quite this severe. The technique she was using, flying by terrain interpretation through instrument readings, was something she'd developed during her active duty years and perfected during 4 years of obsessive study. She read wind direction through engine harmonics, gauged altitude through the way rotor wash echoed off invisible structures below, and navigated by the electromagnetic signatures of the platform's equipment. 8 miles out, her primary navigation system failed. Ice had accumulated beyond the heating system's capacity, and GPS signals were lost in electromagnetic interference from the storm. In a standard aircraft, this would have been mission over, return to base immediately, or risk flying blind into the ocean, but Alexis had prepared for this exact scenario. She switched to backup navigation systems that she'd installed personally, using terrain mapping technology that worked independently of satellite signals. The platform's own emergency beacons painted a navigation picture that allowed her to continue the approach even when conventional systems failed. Viper 14, this is Thunderbird Control. Colonel Reed's voice cut through the static. We're showing you at platform coordinates, but we're not reading any navigation signals. What's your status? Navigation systems compromised but operational, Alexis reported, fighting turbulence that bounced the aircraft up and down like a carnival ride. Continuing approach on backup systems. What she didn't say was that she was now flying in conditions that exceeded every safety protocol in the book. Ice loading was approaching critical levels. Fuel consumption was higher than calculated due to constant maneuvering, and the wind shear around the platform was creating downdrafts that could slam her into the ocean without warning. But 15 people were counting on her, and she'd spent 4 years preparing for exactly this moment. Every modification she'd made to Viper 14, every hour she'd spent studying platform approach procedures, every night she'd lain awake thinking about what she could have done differently in Somalia, it all led to this. 5 miles out, she got her first visual confirmation of the platform. Through brief breaks in the swirling snow, she caught glimpses of the massive structure rising from the churning ocean like an industrial mountain. Emergency lights strobed through the darkness, and she could see the helipad, a small square of deck that looked impossibly tiny from her current altitude. Platform 7, I have visual contact. Beginning final approach. Copy, inbound aircraft. Wind speed is now sustained at 75 mph with gusts to 90. The platform is experiencing structural stress, and we're not sure how long the helipad can support helicopter operations. Alexis began her descent, threading between the 2 massive drilling towers that rose like skyscrapers from the platform's deck. The approach required split-second timing and absolute precision. Too far left, and she'd hit Tower Alpha. Too far right, and Tower Beta would tear off her rotors. The wind was trying to push her off course constantly, and she compensated with control inputs that were part science, part art, and part pure instinct. 2 miles out, she lost her second backup navigation system. Now she was flying by pure visual reference and 4 years of muscle memory. Approaching a platform that was bucking in the storm, swells like a living thing. "Almost there," she whispered, more to herself than to anyone listening. "Just like the old days." But as Platform 7 grew larger in her windscreen, as she could see the desperate faces of the trapped workers gathered near the helipad, Alexis realized that this wasn't like the old days at all. This was something entirely new, a test of everything she'd learned, everything she'd prepared for, everything she'd become during 4 years of waiting for redemption. The platform was a quarter-mile away now, and the real test was about to begin. The approach to Platform 7's helipad was like threading a needle while riding a bucking bronco. Alexis descended through turbulence that would have torn apart a less experienced pilot, her hands making constant micro-adjustments to keep Viper 14 stable between the 2 massive drilling towers. Ice pellets hammered the windscreen like machine gun fire, and the platform's deck lights strobed through the storm like emergency beacons. "Platform 7, I'm beginning final approach," she transmitted, her voice steady despite the aircraft shaking around her like a paint mixer. "Clear all personnel from the landing zone. This is going to be close." "Roger, inbound aircraft, all personnel clear of helipad." Be advised, platform is experiencing structural movement due to storm swells. Deck is not stable. That was an understatement. Through brief glimpses between the snow squalls, Alexis could see the massive platform tilting and rolling as 20-foot waves crashed against its support columns. The helipad, normally a stable landing surface 60 feet above sea level, was moving like the deck of a ship in heavy seas. She'd trained for this scenario, but training and reality were vastly different animals. Landing on a moving platform in perfect weather required exceptional skill. Landing on a moving platform in zero visibility during a storm required something approaching the impossible. 200 feet and descending, she reported, using radar. Altimeter readings, since visual reference was virtually non-existent. The enhanced navigation systems she'd installed were painting a 3-dimensional picture of the platform's layout, but they couldn't compensate for the structure's constant movement. At 100 feet, a massive downdraft caught Viper 14 and slammed it toward the ocean. Alexis felt her stomach drop as the aircraft fell like a stone, altitude bleeding away at an alarming rate. She pulled collective and added power, fighting the invisible hand of the storm that seemed determined to crush her against the churning water below. 50 feet, she called out, sweat beading on her forehead despite the bitter cold. The platform's helipad was directly below her now, a square of deck that appeared and disappeared in the swirling snow. She could see personnel gathered in the platform's superstructure, their faces pressed against windows as they watched her attempt the impossible. The wind shear around the platform was unlike anything she'd experienced. Cross winds tried to push her into the drilling towers while downdrafts attempted to slam her onto the deck with crushing force. She compensated using techniques that couldn't be found in any manual, reading the storm's breath through engine harmonics, feeling the platform's movement through subtle vibrations in her seat. 20 feet, she transmitted, beginning the most challenging part of the landing. The platform's helipad was tilting back and forth like a seesaw, and she had to time her touchdown for the brief moment when the deck would be level enough to support her aircraft's weight. Through the storm, she caught glimpses of the trapped workers. 15 faces pressed against the platform's windows, watching their salvation attempt to land in conditions that defied physics. She could see the desperation in their expressions, the hope mixed with terror as they realized just how dangerous this rescue attempt truly was. The platform rolled to starboard as a massive wave struck its support columns. Alexis compensated by adjusting her heading, keeping Viper 14 positioned over the helipad even as the landing surface moved beneath her. Ice was accumulating on her rotors at a dangerous rate, adding weight and reducing lift efficiency with each passing second. 10 feet, she called out, her voice tense for the first time during the approach. This was the moment of truth. Touchdown on a moving platform in hurricane-force winds with navigation systems failing and ice threatening to bring down her aircraft. She felt the platform's movement through her aircraft's response to the air currents. As the helipad tilted back toward level, she dropped Collective and settled Viper 14 onto the deck with a precision that would have been impressive in perfect weather. In these conditions, it was miraculous. The helicopter's skids touched the platform's deck just as another massive gust tried to flip the aircraft. Alexis immediately lowered Collective fully and applied rotor brake, using every technique she knew to keep the helicopter planted on the unstable surface. The wind was trying to pick up the aircraft and hurl it into the ocean, but Viper 14's enhanced weight distribution and her expert control inputs kept it stable. Platform 7, this is Montgomery. I'm on deck and secure. Send out your personnel immediately. I can't hold this position long in these wind conditions. The platform's crew moved with desperate efficiency. Through her side windows, Alexis could see 15 figures emerging from the superstructure, hunched against the hurricane-force winds. 3 were being carried on improvised stretchers, the injured personnel that Platform 7 had reported. Loading 15 people into an aircraft designed for 8 required creative logistics that Alexis had prepared for during her maintenance years. She'd modified the cabin configuration to accommodate emergency evacuations, installing additional safety harnesses and fold-down seating that maximized passenger capacity. Move fast, she shouted over the rotor noise as the first group of workers reached the aircraft. The platform was rolling heavily now, and she could feel Viper 14's skids sliding on the deck despite her best efforts to maintain position. The injured personnel were loaded first, their stretchers secured with mountaineering rope and emergency restraints. The remaining workers crowded into every available space, strapping themselves in with safety equipment that Alexis had personally installed during her years of preparation. 12 souls on board, called out the platform supervisor, a grizzled man whose face showed the strain of coordinating the evacuation. 3 more coming. A massive wave struck the platform's support columns, sending a shudder through the entire structure. Alexis felt Viper 14 shift dangerously on the helipad as the deck tilted beyond safe parameters. Ice was building up on her rotors at an alarming rate, and she could hear the engines working harder to maintain power in the thin, storm-tossed air. "Hurry," she transmitted. "Platform stability is compromised, and I'm approaching ice loading limits." The final 3 workers sprinted across the helipad, their safety lines trailing behind them as they fought against winds that could knock a man off his feet. They dove into the aircraft just as another gust tried to lift Viper 14 off the deck. 15 souls secure, the supervisor reported. All personnel accounted for. Alexis didn't wait for formal clearance. The platform was moving too violently. The wind conditions were deteriorating beyond survivable limits, and ice accumulation was approaching critical levels. She pulled Collective and lifted off from Platform 7's helipad, climbing away from the industrial structure as it disappeared back into the storm dot, but getting off the platform was only half the battle. Now she had to fly an overloaded aircraft through hurricane conditions back to Thunderbird Air Base, with 15 lives depending on her ability to navigate through weather that was getting worse by the minute. The most dangerous part of the mission was just beginning. Flying an overloaded helicopter through a Wyoming blizzard was like trying to control a falling anvil. Viper 14 struggled to maintain altitude with 15 souls crammed into a cabin designed for 8, every control input requiring twice the normal effort as Alexis fought both the storm and the aircraft's compromised performance. "Thunderbird Control, this is Viper 14, she transmitted, her voice steady despite the chaos around her. "Package secure, 15 souls on board, returning to base. Be advised, aircraft is operating beyond normal weight limits in severe weather conditions. Copy, Viper 14. Outstanding work." What's your estimated time of arrival? Alexis checked her instruments, calculating fuel consumption against the headwinds that were pushing her aircraft backward, almost as fast as she could fly forward. Estimate 90 minutes to base, assuming current weather conditions. What she didn't say was that current weather conditions were deteriorating rapidly, and she wasn't sure Viper 14 could maintain flight for 90 minutes under these circumstances. The ice accumulation was severe enough to affect rotor efficiency. Fuel consumption was higher than calculated due to the overweight condition, and the storm seemed determined to tear her aircraft apart. Behind her in the cabin, the rescued workers, huddled together in conditions that would have violated every passenger safety regulation ever written. The 3 injured personnel were secured on improvised stretchers, while the remaining 12 were strapped into seats, cargo nets, and emergency harnesses that Alexis had installed during her years of modification work. "How bad is it up there?" called out Jim Morrison, the platform supervisor, over the engine noise. "Nothing I can't handle," Alexis replied, fighting a downdraft that dropped the aircraft 300 feet in seconds. "Just a little Wyoming weather." But privately, she was concerned. The storm was intensifying faster than weather services had predicted, and Viper 14 was operating at the very limits of its performance envelope. Every few minutes, she had to cycle the rotor de-icing systems to prevent catastrophic ice buildup, and the engines were working harder than they ever had before. 30 miles from Platform 7, her primary navigation system failed completely. Ice had accumulated beyond the heating system's capacity, and electromagnetic interference from the storm was blocking GPS signals. In normal circumstances, this would have been cause for immediate emergency landing if there had been anywhere to land in the middle of the Wyoming wilderness. "Switching to backup navigation," she announced, activating the redundant systems she'd spent 4 years perfecting. The secondary array painted a picture of terrain and weather patterns that allowed her to continue flying even when conventional navigation was impossible. But the backup systems were showing concerning data. The storm had expanded beyond predicted boundaries, creating a weather front that stretched from horizon to horizon. There was no flying around it, no alternate route that would avoid the worst conditions. The only way home was straight through the heart of the blizzard. "Viper 14, this is Thunderbird Control." Colonel Reed's voice crackled through heavy static. "Weather services are reporting deteriorating conditions along your route. Winds are now sustained at 80 mph with gusts exceeding 100. Recommend emergency landing at alternate field." Alexis checked her charts, knowing what she'd find. Negative control. No suitable emergency landing sites within fuel range. "We're committed to Thunderbird." What followed was 45 minutes of flying that would later be described by meteorologists as impossible. Alexis navigated through wind shear that could have torn the rotors off her aircraft, ice storms that reduced visibility to 0, and turbulence that bounced the overloaded helicopter around like a toy. She flew by instinct, developed over hundreds of dangerous missions, reading the storm's personality through subtle changes in engine harmonics and control response. When instruments failed, she navigated by terrain features memorized during years of studying Wyoming's topography. When visibility dropped to absolute 0, she flew by the way wind patterns echoed off invisible mountain ridges. The passengers behind her endured conditions that would have terrified seasoned military personnel. The aircraft bucked and rolled through turbulence that felt like riding inside a tumbling washing machine. Emergency lighting flickered as electrical systems strained against storm-induced power surges. The temperature inside the cabin dropped steadily as heating systems struggled to keep up with the bitter cold penetrating the aircraft's hull. "How much longer?" asked one of the younger workers, his face pale with a combination of airsickness and terror. "Not long now," Alexis replied, though she wasn't entirely sure herself. Fuel consumption was tracking higher than calculated, and she was making constant adjustments to flight path. and altitude to avoid the worst of the storm conditions. 50 miles from Thunderbird, disaster struck. A massive downdraft caught Viper 14 and slammed it toward the ground with force that overwhelmed even Alexis's expert control inputs. The aircraft fell like a stone, altitude bleeding away at an alarming rate as she fought to arrest the descent. "Mayday, mayday," she transmitted, pulling collective and adding full power as the ground rushed up to meet them. Viper 14 experiencing severe downdraft, altitude loss critical. For a terrifying moment, it seemed like the storm would finally claim its prize. The aircraft continued to fall despite her best efforts, and she could see snow-covered pine trees rising toward them through the windscreen. The passengers behind her were thrown against their restraints as she fought for control, but 4 years of preparation and a lifetime of flying experience finally paid off. Alexis managed to arrest the descent less than 50 feet above the tree line, pulling Viper 14 out of the dive with control inputs that pushed both the aircraft and her own skills to their absolute limits. "Control, Viper 14, she transmitted, her voice slightly strained for the first time during the mission. "Recovered from emergency descent. Continuing approach to base. Roger, Viper 14. Emergency crews are standing by. You're cleared for immediate landing any runway." 20 miles from home, the storm began to weaken slightly. Through breaks in the clouds, Alexis caught glimpses of the lights of Thunderbird Air Base, looking like a beacon of salvation in the darkness. The worst was almost over, but she knew from experience that the final approach could be the most dangerous part of any mission. As Viper 14 limped toward home with its precious cargo of rescued workers, Alexis Montgomery realized that she had finally found her redemption. Not in following orders, not in playing it safe, but in risking everything to bring people home when no one else could. The ghost of David Chun would always be with her. But now she carried something else as well, the satisfaction of knowing that 15 families would sleep peacefully tonight, because she had finally learned to trust her judgment over protocol. The lights of Thunderbird Air Base appeared through the storm like stars breaking through clouds. Each illuminated runway marker a promise of safety after nearly 3 hours of flying through hell. Alexis guided Viper 14 toward the base with the steady hands of someone who had never doubted she would make it home, even when physics suggested otherwise. Thunderbird Tower, Viper 14, requesting immediate landing clearance. She transmitted, fighting crosswinds that were still gusting above safe limits. Aircraft is overweight and low on fuel. Emergency crews standing by. Viper 14, you are cleared for immediate landing runway 09. Wind 320 at 65 gusting to 80. Emergency vehicles are positioned and ready. Through her windscreen, Alexis could see the entire base waiting for her return. Ambulances lined the taxiway, their red and blue lights painting the snow-covered tarmac in emergency colors. Fire trucks were positioned at strategic intervals, ready to respond if her overloaded aircraft couldn't handle the landing. Personnel from across the base had gathered despite the storm, drawn by word that someone had just accomplished the impossible. The approach to Thunderbird's main runway should have been routine after what she'd just survived. But Viper 14 was operating far beyond normal parameters. The aircraft's responses were sluggish due to ice accumulation and overweight conditions. Every control input required careful calculation to avoid exceeding the helicopter's structural limits. 50 feet and descending, she reported, beginning her final approach in crosswinds that would have challenged her, even in perfect aircraft condition. The runway lights strobed past her side windows as she fought to maintain centerline alignment against gusts that tried to push her into the darkness. Beyond the prepared surface at 20 feet, a massive crosswind gust caught Viper 14 and tried to flip it sideways. Alexis compensated with control inputs that would have been impossible in a standard aircraft, but her modifications to the rotor dynamics and control systems allowed her to maintain stability where others would have crashed. The helicopter touched down on Thunderbird's main runway with the gentleness of a butterfly landing on a flower. Despite the chaos that had characterized the entire mission, Alexis immediately lowered collective and applied rotor brake, securing the aircraft against winds that were still trying to push it across the tarmac. Thunderbird Tower, Viper 14 is down and secure. 15 souls delivered safely. Emergency. Medical attention required for 3 injured personnel. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Emergency medical teams rushed toward the aircraft while ground crews secured it against the continuing storm. As Alexis shut down the engines and began her post-flight procedures, she could see personnel streaming across the tarmac despite the dangerous weather conditions. The cabin door opened, and Jordan Price appeared, his face showing a mixture of awe and relief. "Captain Alexis, everyone's asking if you're okay." That was Doc. He struggled for words. That was incredible. Behind him, she could see the rescued workers being helped from the aircraft by medical personnel. The 3 injured were immediately loaded onto stretchers and rushed toward waiting ambulances, while the remaining 12 stood in the Wyoming snow with expressions of people who had just experienced a miracle. Jim Morrison, the platform supervisor, approached her as she climbed down from the pilot's seat. His weathered face showed the strain of the ordeal, but his eyes carried the gratitude of someone whose life had just been saved by pure skill and determination. "Captain Montgomery," he said, extending a hand that shook slightly from cold and adrenaline. "I've been working offshore platforms for 27 years. I've never seen flying like that. Never seen anyone even attempt what you just pulled off." "Just doing my job," Alexis replied, but her voice carried a satisfaction that had been missing for 4 years. "That wasn't a job. That was a miracle." Morrison gestured toward his crew, who were being processed by medical teams. 15 families get to see their loved ones tonight because you were willing to risk everything. That's not something any of us will ever forget. But even as medical teams attended to the rescued workers and ground crews secured Viper 14 against the storm, Alexis knew that her real challenges were just beginning. She had violated direct orders, stolen military aircraft, and conducted an authorized mission that could have resulted in catastrophic loss of life and equipment. Colonel Reed appeared through the storm, his face unreadable as he approached. Behind him came the base's senior staff, including Captain Wells and Lieutenant Owen, their expressions mixing admiration with concern about the consequences of what had just occurred. "Montgomery," Reed said as he reached her position beside the aircraft. "My office, now." The walk across the base was surreal after the intensity of the rescue mission. Personnel lined the corridors despite the late hour, some saluting, others simply staring at the woman who had just accomplished something that would be talked about for decades. Word of the rescue had spread throughout Thunderbird, and everyone wanted to see the pilot who had flown through impossible conditions to save 15 lives. In Reed's office, Alexis stood at attention while the colonel closed the door and took his position behind a desk covered with weather reports, mission logs, and what appeared to be preliminary incident reports. "Sit down, Montgomery. I prefer to stand, sir." That wasn't a request. Reed's voice carried the authority of someone who had commanded troops in multiple combat zones. "You have any idea what you've done? I saved 15 lives, sir. You stole military aircraft. You violated direct orders. You conducted an unauthorized mission in weather conditions that exceeded every safety protocol we have." His voice rose with each accusation. "You could have been killed. You could have lost that helicopter. You could have created an international incident if that rescue had gone wrong." Alexis met his eyes directly. "But it didn't go wrong, sir. I brought everyone home." Reed leaned back in his chair, studying the woman across from him. 4 years ago, she had been one of the Air Force's most decorated pilots. Tonight, she had just proven that time hadn't diminished her capabilities. If anything, her skills had grown beyond what anyone had imagined possible. Montgomery, you know I have to take disciplinary action. Court-martial proceedings, probably. Certainly the end of any hope for return to flight status. For the first time since entering the office, Alexis's composure showed a crack. Not from fear of punishment, but from the realization that after tonight, she might never fly again. Sir, I understand the consequences, but I want you to know that I would do it again. Every time. If people are dying and I have the skills to save them, I'll do it again. Reed nodded slowly. I know you would. That's what makes this so complicated. Outside the office windows, the storm was finally beginning to weaken. 15 families were being notified that their loved ones were safe, and the legend of the pilot who had flown through the impossible was already beginning to spread. Beyond Thunderbird Air Base. What happened next would determine whether Alexis Montgomery faced court martial or commendation, whether her career ended in disgrace or transformation. 3 days after the rescue, Thunderbird Air Base was swarming with investigators. The Air Force had dispatched a team from Colorado Springs to examine every aspect of the unauthorized mission, the stolen aircraft, the violated protocols, modifications that had made the impossible rescue achievable. Alexis sat in the same conference room where her true identity had been revealed, now facing a panel of officers who would determine her fate. Major General Helen Blackwood, a stern woman with silver hair and the bearing of someone who had commanded combat operations in 3 different theaters, led the investigation. Her ice-blue eyes studied Alexis with the intensity of a surgeon examining a complex case. Staff Sergeant Montgomery, she began, reading from a file that seemed impossibly thick for someone who had supposedly been working maintenance for 4 years. Do you understand the severity of the charges being considered against you? Yes, ma'am. Unauthorized use of military aircraft, disobeying direct orders, reckless endangerment of personnel and equipment. Those charges could result in court-martial, reduction in rank, and possible imprisonment. General Blackwood's voice carried the weight of military justice. However, our investigation has uncovered some rather extraordinary circumstances. She opened a folder containing what appeared to be technical specifications and performance reports. Our aviation specialists have examined your modifications to Viper 14. They're calling your work revolutionary and genius-level systems integration. Where did you acquire the knowledge to perform this kind of advanced engineering? Self-taught. Ma'am, I had considerable time to study during my assignment to maintenance duties. Colonel Peterson, one of the investigating officers, leaned forward. 4 years of study resulted in modifications that our best engineers are struggling to understand. The enhanced navigation systems, the structural improvements, the weather-resistant modifications. This represents years of advanced aerospace engineering work. I was motivated to understand the aircraft completely, sir. General Blackwood continued, reading from her notes. We've also interviewed the 15 survivors from Platform 7. Would you like to know what they told us? If you wish to share it, ma'am. Jim Morrison, platform supervisor with 27 years of offshore experience, stated, and I quote, "In nearly 3 decades of platform operations, I have never witnessed flying of this caliber. Captain Montgomery executed maneuvers and conditions that should have been fatal. She saved 15 lives through skill that bordered on supernatural." The general flipped through pages of testimony. Tom Richards, senior drilling engineer. The storm conditions were beyond anything our emergency protocols anticipated. Standard rescue operations would have been impossible. Only someone with extraordinary capability could have pulled off that rescue. Alexis remained at attention, her face impassive as the testimonials continued. But perhaps most interesting, General Blackwood said, is what we discovered about your departure from flight operations 4 years ago. The official record shows a voluntary transfer due to family obligations. What it doesn't show is the real reason. Colonel Reed, who had been silent throughout the proceedings, finally spoke. General, if I may, the circumstances of Sergeant Montgomery's transfer involve classified operations and personal tragedy that I'm aware of the Somalia incident. Colonel. Blackwood's voice softened slightly. Lieutenant David Chun, her fiancé, killed in action while she was executing a medical evacuation. She followed orders instead of attempting an unauthorized rescue that might have saved his life. The room fell silent. Several of the investigating officers looked uncomfortable, realizing they were witnessing the examination of someone whose personal sacrifice had led to this moment of professional insubordination. You transferred to maintenance duty because you couldn't handle the guilt of following orders when someone you loved needed saving. The general continued. And you spent 4 years preparing for the moment when you would face that choice again. Yes, ma'am. The moment when following protocol meant letting people die and trusting your judgment meant breaking every rule in the book. Yes, ma'am, General. Blackwood leaned back in her chair, studying Alexis with new understanding. Staff Sergeant Montgomery, do you know what happens to personnel who steal aircraft and conduct unauthorized missions? Court-martial, ma'am. Likely prison time. Usually, yes. But this case presents some unique circumstances. She glanced at the other investigators. 15 civilian lives were saved through an operation that our own personnel deemed impossible. The families of those workers have written letters to the Secretary of the Air Force requesting that you be commended, not punished. Alexis blinked, surprised for the first time during the investigation. The governor of Wyoming has personally called to request a meeting with you. The Secretary of Defense has inquired about your status. CNN, Fox News, and every major news network in the country wants an interview with the pilot who flew through. The impossible. The general stood up, pacing to the window. You've become something of a folk hero, Sergeant. The pilot who risked everything to save lives when everyone else said it couldn't be done. That wasn't my intention, ma'am. I know. It wasn't, which makes this decision even more significant. She turned back to face Alexis. The Air Force cannot function if personnel routinely ignore orders, no matter how noble their intentions. But we also cannot ignore results like this. General Blackwood returned to her chair. So here's what's going to happen. You're being restored to flight status immediately. With promotion to major, you're also being assigned to develop a new special operations rescue program training elite pilots to handle missions that conventional wisdom says are impossible. Alexis's carefully maintained composure finally cracked. Ma'am, I didn't request. You didn't request it, but you've earned it. The Air Force needs pilots who can do what you did. And we need someone to train them. The general's stern expression softened. This isn't a reward, Major Montgomery. This is recognition of capability. You've spent 4 years turning yourself into the perfect rescue pilot. Now we want you to create others. Colonel Peterson added, the charges against you are being dropped. Officially, you were conducting an authorized test flight of experimental equipment that resulted in a successful rescue operation. However, General Blackwood warned, this is your one exception. If you ever conduct an unauthorized mission again, no amount of lives saved will protect you from prosecution. Are we clear? Yes, ma'am. Good. Report to flight operations tomorrow at 0800. You have a program to build and pilots to train. The general gathered her papers. And Major Montgomery? Yes, ma'am? Your fiancé would be proud. Not because you broke the rules, but because you finally learned when breaking the rules was the right thing to do. As the investigators filed out, Alexis remained seated, struggling to process what had just happened. 4 years of exile, 4 years of preparation, 4 years of waiting for redemption had just culminated in vindication beyond anything she had imagined. Colonel Reed approached as she finally stood to leave. Montgomery, Major Montgomery next. Time you want to steal one of my helicopters, at least file a flight plan. For the first time in 4 years, Major Alexis Montgomery laughed. 6 months after the Platform 7 rescue, Thunderbird Air Base had been transformed into something unprecedented in military aviation. The Enhanced Extreme Weather Rescue Program that Major Alexis Montgomery had developed was attracting pilots from across the country, all eager to learn techniques that had once been considered impossible. The training hangar that had once housed routine maintenance operations now buzzed with activity that would have seemed like science fiction just a year earlier. Advanced flight simulators recreated weather conditions that exceeded normal safety parameters. Modified aircraft incorporated Alexis's revolutionary design improvements. And in the center of it all, the woman who had once hidden her talents behind coveralls and grease stains now wore the uniform of someone who had finally found her true calling. "All right, people," Major Montgomery addressed her latest class of elite pilots, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had proven her theories under the most extreme conditions possible. "Today we're going to discuss platform rescue. Operations in winds exceeding 80 miles per hour. Who can tell me why conventional approach vectors won't work in these conditions?" Lieutenant Casey Owen, one of her first trainees, raised her hand. "Ma'am, crosswind limitations and structural interference from platform equipment create wind shear patterns that exceed aircraft stability parameters." "Exactly. So what's the solution?" Captain Dakota Wells, now one of Alexis's most capable instructors, responded immediately. "Use the platform's own structures as wind breaks. Approach from the northeast vector, threading between drilling towers to create a stable air pocket for landing. And when your primary navigation systems fail due to ice accumulation, switch to terrain mapping backup systems and navigate by electromagnetic signatures from platform equipment," Wells continued. "Just like you did during the Platform 7 rescue." Alexis smiled, remembering when these same pilots had looked at her with skepticism and doubt. Now they spoke her techniques like a common language, pilots who had learned to trust their skills beyond what regulations traditionally allowed. The program had evolved beyond anything military planners had originally envisioned. What started as extreme weather rescue training had become a comprehensive curriculum that pushed the boundaries of what was possible in military aviation. Pilots learned to fly by sound when instruments failed, to read weather patterns through aircraft response, to execute missions that conventional wisdom declared impossible. "Ma'am," asked Lieutenant Tyler Anderson, a young pilot whose enthusiasm reminded Alexis of Jordan Price's curiosity, "when do we get to attempt actual platform landings? When you can successfully execute the simulator scenarios without any navigation aids in weather conditions that would ground commercial aviation," Alexis replied. "Remember, we're not training daredevils. We're training pilots who can save lives when no one else can." After the training session, Alexis walked through the base that had become her second home. The maintenance hangar where she'd spent 4 years preparing for her moment of redemption was now managed by Technical Sergeant Bell, who had been promoted to oversee all aircraft modifications. Jordan Price, now a staff sergeant himself, had become the program's senior maintenance specialist, ensuring that every aircraft met the exacting standards that Alexis had established. But it was the memorial wall that drew her attention most. Often, photographs of successful rescues lined the corridor outside the training center oil platform evacuations, mountain rescues, disaster relief operations. Each image represented lives saved by pilots who had learned to push beyond conventional limitations. The centerpiece was a photograph from 6 months ago, Viper 14 sitting on Platform 7's helipad, surrounded by the 15 workers whose lives had launched this entire program. Below it, a simple plaque read, "Some risks are worth taking when lives hang in the balance. Admiring your handiwork?" Colonel Reed's voice came from behind her. "Admiring theirs," Alexis replied, gesturing to the wall of rescue photographs. 6 months ago, half these missions would have been declared impossible. Now they're routine. Nothing about what you people do is routine, Reed observed. Last week's mountain rescue in Colorado 50-mile-per-hour winds. Zero visibility, landing zone that was barely larger than the aircraft. 3 years ago, we would have waited for better weather and hoped for survivors. And now? Now we have pilots who make the impossible look easy. Reed studied the memorial wall. Your program has saved over 200 lives in 6 months. The Pentagon is talking about expanding it to every base with rescue operations. Alexis nodded, but her expression remained thoughtful. Sir, can I ask you something? Shoot. Do you think I made the right choice? 4 years ago, when I transferred to maintenance instead of fighting to stay in flight operations. Reed considered the question carefully. Montgomery, if you hadn't made that choice, you never would have developed the knowledge and skills that made Platform 7 possible. Sometimes the wrong turn leads to exactly where you need to be. That evening, Alexis sat in her office reviewing applications from pilots who wanted to join the program. Requests came from every branch of the military, from civilian rescue services, even from international allies who had heard about the revolutionary training being conducted at Thunderbird, but it was the letter on her desk that captured her attention, handwritten. On simple stationery, from Jim Morrison, the Platform 7 supervisor. Major Montgomery, it read, I wanted you to know that my granddaughter was born last week. Sarah Elizabeth Morrison, healthy and beautiful. She exists because you were willing to risk everything to bring her grandfather home. I've told her the story about the pilot who flew through the impossible, and when she's old enough to understand, I'll tell her that heroes aren't people who never feel afraid. They're people who do what's right despite the fear. Thank you for showing us what courage really looks like. Alexis set the letter down and looked out her window at the flight line, where tomorrow's training missions were being prepared. Viper 14 sat in its designated spot, the aircraft that had carried her through hell and back, now equipped with even more advanced modifications for training the next generation of impossible pilots. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Jordan Price. Ma'am, just finished the modifications on Viper 17. When you're ready to test the new storm tracking equipment, she's ready to fly. Alexis smiled, remembering the eager young maintenance tech who had asked too many questions. Now he was one of the most skilled aircraft technicians in the Air Force, someone who understood that preparation and precision could mean the difference between success and tragedy. As she prepared to leave for the day, Alexis caught her reflection in the office window. The woman looking back wore the uniform of a major, carried herself with the confidence of someone who had proven her worth under fire, and had finally learned that sometimes the greatest courage comes from trusting your own judgment when everyone else says it can't be done. David Chun's memory would always be with her, but now it carried a different weight. Not the crushing guilt of following orders when love demanded action, but the knowledge that his sacrifice had taught her when rules needed to be broken and when lives mattered more than protocol. Tomorrow she would train more pilots to do the impossible. Tomorrow she would push the boundaries of what conventional wisdom declared achievable. Tomorrow she would continue building a program that turned desperate situations into successful rescues. But tonight, Major Alexis Montgomery was exactly where she was supposed to be, a pilot who had learned that sometimes the most important thing you can do is simply be ready when others can't. When lives hang in the balance and someone needs to fly through the storm, the Ghost of Alaska had found her home at Thunderbird Air Base, and she was never going to stop flying. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.